Hello, my name is Rod Lingle, and I'm a retired golf course superintendent. And I was a superintendent for 50 years, and all 50 years it was on Bermuda grass. Now, some of the early years we were overseeding greens in extreme South Mississippi where the weather was warmer, and we used bent grass there. So we have a little bit of experience with overseeded bent grass. But anyway, I wanted to talk about Ultradwarf and management of Ultradwarf because there's some basic things that people are doing that I think really cause them issues. And I'd like to go into a little bit of the history of Bermuda and kind of where it was when I started and where it is today. And you can see the difference, and it makes some of this makes sense of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But when I was in Memphis Country Club for 37 years, we had 328 for 20 of those years, and 17 of those years we had it champion Ultradwarf. But we also had some individual complete test greens in Tiff Eagle and in also in Mini Verde. And also we were in the original Tiff Eagle trials. I think there were like 30 or 32 test sites in the United States. And Memphis Country Club was the most northern test site, according to Dr. Hanna. And he rated the plots every year personally. He went to each site and rated them. And I believe he told me that we rated #1 in all the test sites every year, even though we were the most northern. But that's not a testament to me so much as it is a testament to our staff and our program of management, because when we had these grasses, all three grasses, you could look at the Mini Verde, the Tiff Eagle, and the Champion, and if you were out there looking at them, you probably would say they all look equally as good. And we did the same management procedures on all of them, which is what we're going to talk about here. Now, before we get to Ultradwarf, I'd like to back up a minute and go into 328. And of course, some of y'all probably know that 328 is the parent grass that was irradiated with cobalt radiation to produce Tiff Eagle. So Tiff Eagle's primary parent is 328, even though it wasn't originally supposed to be. That's what wound up being irradiated, and they proved that through some DNA samples. But anyway, yeah, I think that's one reason Tiff Eagle is a pretty durable grass, is because it came out of 328 stock. Now, I do think it is a little bit coarser grass than some of the others, but all the grasses, 90% of all the grasses comes down to management. And that's what we want to talk about right now. Okay, going back to 328. 328 was a much more open grass. It was wider, bigger leaf blade, much more open. It would really be a great comparison to compare 328 and Ultradwarf to Pencross and A and G series bentgrass, because Pencross was wider, more open, not near as tight, not as small. The same thing holds true for 328 versus, and you could also throw Tiff Dwarf in that same category, even though Tiff Dwarf was smaller than 328. It was not as small as the Ultradwarfs. But when you compare those grasses, they have some things in common, believe it or not. I remember Dr. Beard saying, it was actually put in a publication I read early on when Pencross was the primary grass that was being used everywhere for bent grass. And then when A and G series came out, and after a couple of years, he said, "Hey guys, we need to kind of rethink management on these grasses because they're a lot more dense than Pencross, and we really probably need to think about putting less fertility and less nitrogen down on these grasses than we did Pencross, even though it's a bent grass, because Pencross was much more open and wider." And he said the genetics in the A and G series grass, because they're so much more dense, plants per square inch, that we just don't need to fertilize them as much. And with nitrogen, particularly, you're not going to get any growth if you just put an iron, very little growth. Nitrogen is the driving fertility source that really drives everything on growth of grass. So, when 328 was out, it was kind of the same thing. It was wider, more open. It took more nitrogen during the year to keep it dense enough to keep from having issues with it on your putting greens, particularly in the shade. Whereas when we switched to ultra dwarfs, we noticed right away that we needed to reduce our nitrogen rates because it would get too thick and too puffy. Now, in the old days on 328, before I go into that, let me say this about density. And really, this is what I like to refer to. This little talk I'm giving is about canopy density control. And that's really what managing good greens is all about. And it doesn't matter whether it's Pencross, 328, or Ultra Dwarf. You got to have enough grass on the surface to give a good putting surface. But if you get any grass that gets too thick and too puffy, over fertilized and thatchy, it's not a good putting surface. I don't care what variety it is, it's not good. There's a lot of negative things that happen with too thick canopy density. Whereas if you're, on the other hand, if you're too thin, you run into issues like algae, weed invasion, and poor putting quality. So those things, you have to balance those, and maintaining a perfect ideal canopy density is really what good greens management is, from the mechanical side of it or the cultural side of it. Now let's go back to the old days of 328. 328, when I was coming up, everything was everybody seemed to be kind of doing the same thing, and that was they usually aerify it 3 times a summer, core aerify it, whether they needed it or not, and usually it needed it, and they would top dress it maybe 2-3 times a summer, maybe, or maybe 3 times a year. And some people would only top dress it when they aerified it, and that was it. And so, and usually in greens that had cation exchange capacity of say 3, which is a big factor we'll talk about later. 3 is a kind of a little bit on the high end of cation exchange capacity. I like to see 4, but 3 is, and that's really what determines most of your fertility, is how your greens are constructed in the cation exchange capacity. But back in the old days, we had the cation exchange capacity of about 3, maybe 3.5, sometimes pushing 4. And we would put about 6 pounds, 5 or 6 pounds in a year on 328 to keep it consistently good. And when we switched over to the Ultra Dwarf, that became 1 to 2 pounds a year. And that was just all we needed. I mean, we just didn't need any more. If we put more than that on our greens at the time, and you got to understand our greens were, I'd say 3.5 cation exchange capacity, and that's kind of where we were. And basically, the top dressing regimes and all that have completely changed. Aerification's changed somewhat. Some people still aerify up 2 or 3 times a summer. It depends really on the length of your growing season. But 328, when I moved to Memphis, we had 328 there also. And I think it was probably planted about 1960 or somewhere in there. And one of the things that we noticed, or I had noticed personally, was about in the early 80s, there were some articles being written about people in California top dressing cool season grasses, bent grass, poana, weekly, light, frequent top dressing. And I'm thinking, boy, that's a lot of work. I don't know if we really need that, and then I got to thinking about it. it really does keep down your thatch production because it dilutes your thatch, your growth as it's producing thatch. All that gets diluted as it's growing. And if you have the right sand quality, you're thinking, well, probably going to improve my structure if I'm using the correct sand size. And if my sand is real uniform and not too big, it's probably going to make my greens putt better and smoother. So we were the first people that I'm aware of. I mean, we were kind of in a goldfish bowl. We weren't really paying attention to what anybody else was doing. And we started doing some of those procedures. We started light frequent top dressing once a week. And the other thing that we did that nobody else was doing at the time, that we were walk mowing all greens, and we were also double cutting in the summer when it got real warm. We were double cutting every day, 7 days a week. And boy, did that make a difference. I mean, it just transformed our greens. It went from old Bermuda grass to really good putting surfaces. In fact, that was probably the driving reason that in the early 80s, when Memphis area started switching to bent grass, we went, we were one of the last courses that never did switch. And one of the reasons we didn't switch is because during the growing season, which is the primary golf season in Memphis, the warm season, we just felt like our surfaces were better. And I think most people, if they were honest, like professional golfers would comment, they thought they were better, weren't soft, they didn't plug, they weren't pulling hoses, they weren't having syringe, we didn't have fans running. And I used to always say, nothing says sustainable like fans, right? Boy, that's the most horrible thing in the world is have a fan right by a green trying to play golf. But anyway, we uh we had small greens and we had incredibly good greens for 328. And then not long after the early 80s, I want to say, I don't remember the year Primo came out, but we had actually gotten some of the early material that was released through Syngenta so we could do research with it. And we actually did some research on greens with it. And boy, did it make a difference on Bermuda. I mean, it was just, it would take it would take at least 50% of that bigness out of that grass and make it so much smaller. And we felt like it helped with our texture dramatically, helped with a lot of things. But the things that we were doing to 328 had already set us up for Ultradwarf management because that's what a lot of the really good guys are doing now that have really good Ultradwarf. They're doing light frequent top dressing weekly during the growing season, and they're doing light frequent vertical mowing. And we were doing the same thing on 328. So we kind of had to figure it out, except for the fact that it didn't take us very long to realize that the nitrogen rates were going to be way less. We just didn't need it. It's like Dr. Beard said, we don't need to be fertilizing the A and G series bent grass like they did Pencross. And his famous statement, if I never forget, written in print, because the density is built into the genetics. And it is. I mean, think about it. The genetics of these grasses are so much smaller and tighter and so many more leaf shoots per square inch than the old Pencross and 328. We don't need to like go crazy with fertility. So that's a real big part of this is the real the three keys I think of managing your canopy density is managing your fertility. Don't get too much nitrogen. Manage it by site and need, not by schedule and frequency. Light, frequent vertical mowing when the grass is growing, uh, particularly when it's growing fast, and top dressing frequently. Light, frequent top dressing with a quality sand. And you have to understand all those three processes. That well, two of them, vertical mowing and top dressing, is the temperatures increase and the grass grows faster. The frequency, the interval of those two processes compress. You might be in May and say in the Memphis area or April, you might top dress once or twice during April, and then maybe twice in May, and maybe vertical mow twice. in those months. Whereas when June hits and it gets real hot, you're going to be vertical mowing weekly and top dressing weekly. So as the grass speeds up growth, you're just compensating for that growth and keeping that thatch and puffiness out of your grass by staying up with the speed of growth on the grass. That's all you're doing. And as when it gets cold in the winter, you don't do any of those. You don't need to. You might need to top dress in the winter, maybe once or twice to smooth things out. But it's really more of a putting quality thing than it is a thatch control thing like it is during the growth season. One of the things I have made a little list here. I'm looking at my list about thick, puffy greens. Some of the negative things. One, of course, they're puffy, they're soft, they're thatchy, they're grainy. The thicker they get, the worse the grain's going to be. If you don't believe that, just look at the cup flaking on Ultradwarf. It's worse when it's thicker than it is when it's thin and managed properly. Disease increases when it's too thick. You have elevated crowns when you get thatch production. Elevated crowns increases winter kill because there's not as much insulation there. And also, the thicker it becomes, the more hydrophobic it becomes. That thickness provides some hydrophobic there that's not there when it's not that thick. So there's a lot of negative things associated with being too thick. And usually you see guys on Ultradwarf, and why I got into this 328 management practices. There are some people trying to manage Ultradwarf like 328. They're doing, 2 or 3 aerifications a summer, which is not like super bad, but it's really bad for the golfers. And I don't think you need it if you manage your nitrogen, your light vertical mowing, and your top dressing properly. You can probably get by with 1 or 2 aerifications a summer. We got by with 1 in Memphis, and people say, well, the growing season's shorter, yada yada. Well, when I went to Texas for 7 years, we got by with 1 there too. We didn't know if we would be able to, but we were, and it was fine. It worked great. They're doing 1 now because they kind of continue what we were doing. And sometimes, if you want like extra aerification, you can just go 2 directions and do it one time instead of doing it once in June and another in August. And you're going to remove just as much material. You just go 2 directions. But anyway, we can talk about aerification later. We're really not talking about aerification during this talk. So here's one of the things that I discovered at Memphis, because we tried everything. One of the things that we did do there, we did a lot of experimentation. This is the blade that I recommend to everybody. It's a Toro blade. The part number is 171590. 17-1590 Toro. You can see how thin it is, very thin. And when it comes new, it has these little square tips. There it was cut across square. And as you use these, this thing will thin up even more. But the thickness of this blade, what makes it so good on Ultradwarf, is 0.042 inches, which is barely above 1 millimeter in diameter. Now, a lot of people think you got to do it with carbide, but it's just that, I go to my grave with this one. This is the best blade I've ever used. When we were in Memphis, we had 10 years running consecutively that we used, that we had USGA field day for Ultradwarf management. And of all the people that came to the seminar, this was probably the biggest takeaway and the most positive feedback that we got. People switching to these blades and using, by the way, we think the spacer setting on this is real important. A lot of people have 3 spacers in between there. That's too wide. That's about 3/4 of an inch. It doesn't affect enough surface area. I like 2. You can use 1, but when you use 1, you're only about 1/4 of an inch between blades, and it gets really tight, making the right height adjustment without really gouging your greens. and it wants to pull the grass up more. And the other thing about really close spacing, like one spacer, is that it pulls the grass up and puffs. It makes it puff when it pulls up. And when it pulls up and you come back and mow it, it's going to scalp. And it's a little bit, the two spacing we think is really perfect. And we just feel like that some months, if you ever get behind, you can go two directions vertical mowing instead of one. And when you vertical mow, you always backtrack mow. You go down and come back the same pass, and then move over. Go down and come back the same pass, move over. Because that takes care of going up grain or down grain. Because when you go down grain with a vertical mower, it's the most aggressive positioning going down grain. Actually, if you have a front to back grain, just go out and look at it. If you mow down grain first, it's the most aggressive pass. And you come back on the same line going uphill, it's a little bit less aggressive. And it also helps push that grass back down a little bit. Because you got to realize what's happening is this blade's going around. I'll use my fingers. As it goes around, and this is the grass and it's laying downhill, which almost all Ultradwarf does. And this is coming around, it's grabbing this and pulling it this way. So it pulls it up, it's more aggressive. Where if it's going uphill and the grains, as it comes down, the grain's already laying down and it's really, it does some good, but it doesn't do as much as going down grain. And I tell people there's some basic things about vertical mowing that you really need to do. And one of those is put water down before you vertical mow. If it's not a heavy dew in the morning, and even if it is a heavy dew, by the time you finish vertical mowing 9 holes, you need to start putting water down in front of it, because water's a lubricant and it keeps it from pulling that grass, and it lets it slice through that grass a lot easier, and keeps a lot of the headache of puffiness being pulled up and then scalping off out of your vertical mowing. So you always want to pre-water, like right, most of the guys have got phones and now and it, radios and whatever to control with. So we would always put the water down. I mean, like as soon as that water quit running, that greens mower was on that green. 3 minutes is all it takes, and just enough to wet it down. And it does a tremendously better job with some lubrication. If you don't believe it, just go out when it's really dry in the day. The way we found out that that was a huge difference maker for us was that we were doing vertical mowing one morning. We always started super early, like dark or before daylight or right at daylight. And usually there's a dew down in the summer, and you can get good lubrication with the dew. And something happened. There was an unexpected. It was on a Monday, and we typically weren't closed on Mondays in Memphis, which was kind of tough for us. That's why we started early, but we found a way to make it happen, to make it, start early and do it. But somebody had a special event or party they didn't tell us about, and they said, you got to stop. We got somebody coming. We were on the backside. So we quit doing it. And after they finished with their round late that afternoon, we came back out trying to finish. And we had the same mower, same height setting. Everything was the same. As soon as the guy got on the green, he had just got off of number 12. I remember it like yesterday. It pulled really bad. I'm going like, man, call my mechanic, said, you got something wrong here. We got something's become wrong. We're off on our setting. We're too deep. We're pulling. Well, he went and checked and he said, we're right on. And I said, gosh, what's wrong? What's the difference? And it hit me. What's the difference between now and this morning? We were dew this morning and we're dry now. We're really dry. And so I said, get back off the green. We put 3 minutes to water down, just enough to wet the green down. Went back out in vertical mode. It was perfect. It was just like it was this morning. So if you don't think that works, try it. It does work. Now, the vertical mowing part, like I said, is super important. I mean, if you do it right, it actually the ball will roll better after you finish vertical mowing than before. It just, we don't believe in super aggressive vertical mowing. If you use carbide blades, you're going to have aggressive vertical mowing. It's not going to be user friendly. Golfers don't like it. Golfers never complain about when we vertical mowed. They never knew we did. In fact, I had some professional golfers that would play the day after we vertical mowed and said they liked seeing that. That's what they knew when they saw that little bitty line that this small vertical mowing blade produces, that they had good putting quality, and it gave them confidence. But um, anyway, vertical mowing is incredibly important, and usually when you vertical mow, it's good to top dress after because the sand gets in those little slits and gives you a little bit better uh, penetration of the sand. And usually they kind of go hand in hand, but top dressing is hugely important also because it dilutes the thatch layer. It produces a firmer surface. It just makes the ball roll smoother. And one of the things that people don't think about, they always think that, hey, I noticed when I top dress, the next day the green speeds are a little bit faster, and they are. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I've been on greens that were real puffy. You know, walked up on a green, guys had trouble, and guys said, come. So we went and got some top dressing sand, and I showed him. I said, let me show you. And I put some sand in a little area about as big as this, and I brushed it in with my hand and put it down pretty thick. And I said, step on that. And you can feel it's already firmer than the area that wasn't top dressed. And it helps firm the green up. And that's one of the reasons when you get puffy, you scalp so bad. Particularly when that mower comes and they drop it on the green, or the hydraulic drops it on the green. Usually when you make your turn, going into the grain, it scalps bad. Because for a brief moment in time, that weight of that unit is hitting that soft canopy and it's compressing. And when it's compressing, it's actually violating the mowing height briefly. And it gets down too low and below that canopy and scalps. And the bed knife grabs and pushes. So it's all kind of bad things can happen when you get too thick. And like I said, this is what this is about: canopy density control. Um, Back to top dressing. When you're top dressing greens, one of the things you want to keep in mind is, I know people are all hung up on this super fine sand, and yeah, it's easy to work, and yeah, it works in good, and yeah, it puts good, but boy, it sure doesn't help your pore space in your greens. You know, if you get into super fine sands, uh, you start losing macro pore space and you get into micro pore space. Some of y'all might be a little bit confused with that terminology, but micro pore space is capillary pore space, and that's the water that's held against the forces of gravity, and it can't be moved. It won't drain. And the macro pore space is non-capillary, and it's gravity water, so to speak. So, and the oxygen content in micro pore space is not near as good as it is in macro pore space. So you got bigger pores, you got better oxygen movement, you got better water movement, and you got better oxygen content in proper size sand. And people think, well, I got to use it because the big sand don't put good. Well, for years at Memphis, we used a sand that was basically 70% of the sand fraction was between a quarter of a millimeter and a half a millimeter. It's 0.25 millimeters and 0.50 millimeters. And that's where the USGA wants your sand to be. And I'm sitting here looking at one of these old Hummel reports right here that I had, and you go looking at USGA specs on particle size. They want you to have no more than 5% in the very fine fraction, and in the fine fractions, they want you to have less than 20%, and in the coarse, which I just gave to you, the medium and the coarse, the medium is 0.25 millimeters, the coarse is 0.50. They'd like to have greater than 60% of that. And if you can get 60, 70, even 80% of that in that range, that medium to coarse fraction, boy, you're going to have some good greens for a long time. And people don't think about this, but now Dr. Kara at Georgia brought this to my attention. And of course, he's a very, very smart guy. I really respect him. And it's true. Your oxygen content in the very, very fine sands is not very good. And when you have low oxygen, you get into anaerobic conditions. And when you get into anaerobic conditions, thatch layers do not break down very fast. So guys that are using proper size sand are having better oxygen content in the soil, better decomposition of organic matter, thatch layer. So there's just there's a reason that that quarter to a half a millimeter size is such a holy grail of sands. And we found that in Memphis, there was a sand that we liked. It was called a Metro sand. It was the Metro Materials. And they had a sand that was really good, except it had a little bit of bigs in it. And you know, those big particles, so you can't putt on those very well. And what we did, I got the guy to screen out anything bigger than 1 millimeter. And 1 millimeter sounds like big compared to half a millimeter, but it's really not that much bigger. They put a screen on it where everything, nothing would pass through that was 1 millimeter or bigger. And boy, that made a wonderful sand. And it was really uh, something that we tried to shoot for from the day one that I walked on those greens in 1979. We were trying to always build a better surface, even though the greens were 100 years old. When I left there, those greens were 105 years old, and they were some of the best I'd ever seen. But in reality, we had over 37 years, we had built that profile. And there were some things that we did to help that, like add zeolite to the profile to increase our cation exchange capacity. Now, there again, the top dressing is just like the vertical mowing. It increases as your growth rate increases. When I say increase, the interval, the time interval, where you were doing it every other week in high 85, 80 temperatures, when it got into 90, 95 temperatures, you were top dressing every week to keep up with the growth rate. And also, I tell people fertility management is incredibly important, because if you over fertilize ultra dwarf, it's already a thick, dense grass, and you can actually ruin it. I mean, you can over fertilize it to the point you can't catch it. You cannot keep up with the vertical mowing and top dressing. You can try, but you're going to produce so many stolons upon stolons upon stolons that you're going to run into some issues. So I tell people, I don't know how. I'm sure you could do it maybe some way with computers now, that you could look at soil temperature, like, growing degree days and all. But, even that has some limitations with things like shade and things like that. But, I still felt like that I was the best judge of fertility. And one of the things that I did, whether it was in Texas, which was much warmer than Memphis, much warmer, big greens, totally different. And this system worked just as well out there as it did in Memphis. We just had to make some common sense adjustments, because it was a lot warmer, and it was warmer earlier, and it was warmer in the winter. But by and large, we used the same exact thing. And we always tried to manage our nitrogen and look at our canopy and being able to tell, is that canopy too thick or too thin? If it's too thick, you're going to maybe need to vertical mow and top dress a little more, or maybe a little heavier. And I've had people call me that are too thick, and I said, you've got to use these thin blades, because if you don't, you're going to create such a mess that your members are going to run you off, and it just brutalizes that Ultradwarf. It does not like that super aggressive mowing. And still, I mean, you can do it, but you're going to give up about a month. And I have some good stories about that. There was a guy, I'm not going to bring up any names, in Memphis, and it was a real good club. But early on, before they started doing this with the thin blades, they were using carbide tip blades, and they'd really get aggressive. And they were vertical mowing once a month in the summer. And top dressing, I don't know how often they were doing that, but I know they were doing once a month, and they were doing it real heavy. And there was a guy that played on the tour that came up to me, and he said, "What's wrong? Our greens are only good like 2 days a month. They scalp them down, they cut all the grass off of them, vertical mow them to the ground, They come back and fertilize them real heavy, and then when they get to a point to where they're just about good at the end of the month, they're about right. We have 2 or 3 days of good. They come in and repeat it again. And if you think about it, that's a lot what goes on with vertical mowing and aerifying. Guys will aerify real aggressive, and then they'll fertilize real aggressive because they can't stand to look at it. Members are complaining it's taking a long time to grow back in. And there's been some studies that show that if you do that, if you over fertilize during aerification, and the same can be said about vertical mowing, that if you go super aggressive and as you're trying to grow it back in because your members are all complaining and it looks like crap, that you just negated everything you were trying to do to get rid of. You just added more to it. And there's been some studies on aerification that show that if you over fertilize, trying to get those holes to fill in too quickly because people are complaining or you use too big a tine, that you wind up in the long term, like a couple months later, with more thatch and bad stuff than you started out with. And you have to understand that light frequent beats heavy infrequent every day. And I don't care whether it's golf course management, restaurant management, home cleanliness, I don't care what it is. Just think about this. If you have a guy that, and like I said, back in the early 80s, we kind of figured this out with this light frequent top dressing on all 328 and light vertical mowing. But if you have a business, a restaurant, or whatever it is, and people are coming in and out all the time, and you want your shop to look beautiful and clean, is it going to look best if it's somebody comes in every night and cleans that thing and does a really nice job for the next day, every day? Or if they come in and do it once a month? Think about it. It would look like crap. And we had a saying that we used to use it. Are you going to take out the trash once a week? Or are you going to take it out once a month? Which one's going to look better? You don't need vertical mow every day. I'm not saying that. Everything has a frequency that's best. But think about it. If frequency doesn't matter, why do people double cut greens during the US Open or triple cut US greens during the US Open? Because frequency has a cause and effect. And usually as you increase the frequency, particularly like, because I view thatch and grain production as negatives, like bad things. So that's the trash. So I want to take out the trash frequently. I don't want to let it build up and have these wild swings in quality that you get when you vertical mow real heavy and then you fertilize it real hard and you go and grow it back and it's all, well, then all of a sudden you get 5 days of rain in Memphis and you're, or Florida or wherever, Birmingham, and all of a sudden you're thicker than when you started and you got to repeat it again. And it's not golfer friendly. Whereas this light frequent thing, I guarantee you, if you come play greens behind what we were doing, the day after we vertical mow and top dress, the greens putt the best. They putt the best. Now you got to keep the big particles out of the sand. You got to screen it or you got to find one. And that's a huge part of this is finding a perfect sand. Not too fine. And I know that some people top dress with, it looks like talcum powder. I mean, it's like dust. And I'm not going to say it doesn't work great and putt good, but it scares the heck out of me for long-term management on my greens. You know, and I had a young man, I was giving a talk in the Carolinas. I forget the course. I think it was Myrtle Beach somewhere. And a young man came up to me and he had Tiff Eagle. I remember that. And I was talking about this same thing about particle size. And he said, you know, Rod, he said, we did the same thing. We used a super fine top dressing and our greens got just going downhill, downhill, downhill. And we had an Istrix pulled. And it said this stuff was sealed off so bad we had like, you know, I forgot what he said, like an eighth of an inch perk rate or something stupid, like quarter of an inch. He said we had to take that top 4 or 5 inches that we had built up over the years out of there and put down a greens mix. And it said that we, you know, we uh, just have tried to find a sand that's more compatible with what you're talking about, like a half a millimeter to a quarter millimeter in diameter. Now, some guys are doing the fine top dressing and then airifying a couple of times a year and doing real coarse, like greens build top dressing mix, and that's a lot better than nothing. I can tell you, I don't know if that's the answer or not, but I always wanted to shoot for the best that I could get. And I know my greens were, the sand appeared to be a little coarser. If you look at them, you can see the difference, but the putting quality was there. I've got videos of guys putting behind the sand without it being brushed in. And that was another thing, brushing that sand in is real important. We used to use big push brooms to brush them in, and they're all kind of different Rubico 8-foot brooms, or the do the brushes that are made in England that they knock dew off with are real good. But there's ways to do it. We use a little 4-foot wide brush. There was a floor sweep brush that did excellent, but getting that brushed in so your mowers don't fight it was a big part of it. But let me backtrack. I just thought about something about the vertical mowing. If you vertical mow and you're a little bit too deep and it's pulling up, well, you do need to go back to the shop and change your hot setting. You don't just need to pull your grass up where it's puffed up. You can see it. And then if you go mow it with it puffed up, it's going to scalp. Now, usually if you go out and it's got these little thin blades, you can get areas that are a little bit thick that'll puff up. And sometimes 1 or 2 greens will puff up. Our 12th green at Memphis were always one of the ones that did that, because it was in full sun. It was one of the few ones that didn't have shade, and it grew faster. And so we always kind of watched it real close. But if it ever puffs on you, before you mow it, if you got some areas out there, go back out there and put a speed roller or a roller on it and try to mash it back down before you mow it. Because if you don't, it's going to scalp. Now, sometimes we would put a little water, like a 3-minute cycle of water or 4 minutes, and then roll it. And that worked better than just rolling it if it was dry. But you want to kind of iron that thing back down, because if you don't, and it's pulled up pretty good, it's going to scalp. It's going to be nasty. And Ultradwarf, it's like A&G series bentgrass. Y'all remember what the complaint was about the A&G series when it first came out? It didn't recover from ball marks, and it didn't recover in the fall as fast as bentgrass, because it's not as big a grass. Small grasses, smaller root systems, smaller storage sites, and just my theory, smaller recovery. And if you remember, back in the old days, all the cold tolerant Bermudas, before they got into latitude 36 and Tahoma 31 and all those, were big Bermuda grasses. There were common types, Vailmont, Mid-Iron, looked like common. And they had big root systems, big storage sites, more gas in the gas tank, just a bigger recovery potential. But Ultradwarf, if you scalp it real bad, it can get ugly, and it can be a long time coming back. I've seen guys screw up vertical mowing with big blades to where they scalped crowns, where it went over a crown to scalp real bad, where they'd have to resod that. It didn't grow back. So, the slight frequent thing is a lot safer and a lot more sure. So, let me talk briefly about fertilization. I'm a big believer, just because of the history of what I've done and the root systems that we produced, particularly in Texas. We produce some unbelievable root system on Champion, which is usually not possible. But for out there, those greens were built a lot better than my greens in Memphis. They were Fazio greens built for bentgrass, and they had profile built into them, and they had really good porosity. And they also had real high cation exchange capacity, which was unusual for Texas. But we did, and that's one of the things you have to understand, that from a 30,000-foot view, if you're talking about cation exchange capacity, I think that's the number one thing in importance in growing good Bermuda greens. That and sunlight, of course, not having too much shade. But if you get cation exchange capacities in the 1s and 1.5s and 2s, it's a little hard, particularly like on a new green. It's like 1 or 1.5. And I like to see a 4 or better if it's possible. And it is possible. You can build a green that drains well, but you got to either add zeolite to it, like Ecolite, or you got to add profile, a porous ceramic. And now porous ceramics, I think they have one advantage in they're real stable and they add the size of the particles pretty big, so it adds a lot of macro pore space, which really helps your root systems grow and helps the porosity. But they're not near as high in cation exchange capacity as zeolite. Typically, profile or porous ceramics have about a 30 cation exchange capacity. And that's where a lot of clay materials are, like around the 30s. And you got to realize that these particles, these profile material, is nothing but fire heated clay. It's like a brick. You know, it's heated in a kennel. It's clay is all it is, but it's real stable and firm and hard like a brick. And when you look at the cation exchange capacity of zeolite, it's between 100 and 150. So you're looking at 3 to 4 to 5 times more cation exchange capacity by volume than you are in a profile, so our porous ceramic. So that be aware of that. We used to use it in Memphis. We use zeolite a fair amount because we wanted to keep our cation exchange capacities up around 4, between 3 and 4 for sure. And because you gotta know this, because if you go into if you have low cation exchange capacity greens, new greens are like 1.5, 1.2, your amount of fertility nitrogen that you need to put on those greens to keep your density adequate and not be too thin, which can happen, you're gonna need more fertility. And so when people say, "Oh, I only put 1 pound a year, I put 2 pounds a year," well, that just depends on what you're growing it in. That's it, plain and simple. You can't you Everybody wants to do what the guy down the street does. Don't do what he does. Do what you make sense in your head agronomically, and do what your experimentation shows you works best. Now, I would say that if you had a cation exchange capacity in Memphis, Tennessee, or Texas, where I was working, just north of Austin, and your CECs are 1.2, 1.5, you're probably going to need to be putting 3 or 4 pounds of N down a year. But if your cation exchange capacities are above 4, you're probably only going to need 2 pounds a year, or maybe 1. And it depends a lot on, how you do it, your timing, when you're putting it down. And the only way I know to do it, I just don't think you can cookbook it. I don't think you can do it. You have to go out there yourself or your best agronomist. And I realize that some of you guys ain't all into the agronomy part of it like I was or am. And you're more of a CEO type and you stay a lot of time in the office. Well, if that's what you do, you better hire a good agronomy guy because he's the guy that needs to be looking at that grass every day, every day. You might miss a weekend or something like that, yeah, but 5 days a week, somebody needs to be on that green. They needs to be rolling the ball with a putter, and that's how you tell. That's how you tell when it's really good. That's the one thing I did every day that I was there. I would always try to putt the ball, and even if I forgot my putter and I had a wedge, I would putt with. You can putt with a wedge. You just putt with the wedge, and you check your roll on the ball, and you can say, okay, I'm too thin or I'm too thick, and that's where you know there's no hard and fast rule. The best rule I could give you is like the speed of the growth of grass. That's but that's still not hard and fast because like even in Memphis or even in Texas, you'd have a big event, you'd have to miss a week, and you may have to do it next week, and you may have to do it 2 directions, or you may have to put your top dressing down a little heavier to catch back up. But you can miss a week, okay? And particularly if it's cold, you're not going to be doing any of those vertical mowing, top dressing. Maybe a top dress, but I would not vertical mow when it's real. Maybe Florida, because you get growth year round there, but not the Memphis, not when grass goes dormant or semi-dormant. So back to fertility, I really like granular fertility because I just think it produces a healthier plant and a bigger root system for sure. Now I do use liquid fertility, but I think of liquid fertility as just a tweaking. like a light thing. Like if you're spraying Primo once a week, like most people are in the summer, you can throw in you're gonna have a little bit of, you should have in there some manganese, some magnesium, and some iron if you can get it with it. And that's going to give you your color. Never think, never use nitrogen for color. If you do, you're going to get too thick because it's going to produce the thickness. If you're looking for color, use manganese, magnesium, or iron in some type of formulation in your spray tank with your Primo for color. That way you don't get the flush of growth. And as far as nitrogen sources go, I do like soluble. If I'm using granular, I still like fast release materials because I know it's not going to be around and hang around when I'm getting 5 inches of thunderstorms and a week worth of rain every day, and I'm all of a sudden I'm too thick. I want to be able to have a more predictable release on my fertility. And now there is an exception to that in that if you have really super low cation exchange capacity, like a lot of sand, things are moving through the profile, you may have to be on some light, slow release to provide some backbone in that green to keep it from becoming too thick. But where I'm going with all this, you've got to go out there and look at it. If you had a week where you had a lot of rain or something happened, it was real humid. And that's another thing that plays a huge part in this growth rate on this grass is humidity. When it gets humid, real humid and hot, grass grows the fastest Bermuda grass does. You talk to the guys in Phoenix and Tucson and all those areas that have very low humidity. They say, well, our grass never grows, our Bermuda never grows until we hit our monsoon season, which I believe they said is July, and they get rain. And when they get humidity up, they said, man, this grass goes crazy because the humidity, it was hot before, but the humidity was 5 and 10%. And that's a huge factor in this grass growing. So you always need to remember that. So, but if you have low cation exchange capacity, you might want to have some slow release periodically in there to give a backbone to that. But I did like granular, and there's nothing wrong with using liquid, but I view liquid as like makeup on a lady. It makes her look better, but it's not perfect. It's not the answer. Plastic surgery might be the answer, but makeup may be. It's kind of like it's a tweak. It's a short-term thing, and I would use if I'm using liquid. I did like potassium nitrate soluble a lot, and throw in a big micro package with that, the magnesium, the manganese, iron, and I love that combination. And as far as granular goes, which is the bulk of my fertility, particularly if I was getting real thin, like in a shady spot, I'd go tweak that and fertilize it with, even with a little spreader, just put it down right there, just turn it on, turn it off right there. Because you're always going to get thin in areas like where shade overlaps the corner of a green. And you don't need to fertilize the whole green. If the whole green is perfect and you're thin in one little shady spot, why you want to fertilize this spot out here and be too thick here, and now you get good back here where you're shady? Because you may fix the shady spot by fertilizing it and catching up, but you're going to be too thick out here. So you have to do a little bit of micromanagement, best management practices on fertility where you need it, not where you don't need it. And there are times in the year, particularly in the fall and the spring, early spring and in the fall, when you can fertilize Ultradwarf and it not blow up on you so bad. Something about those low temperatures, you need a little extra fertility. Sometimes you can do it then, but when it's hot and humid, you got to really watch it. And we only fertilize it based on need. Just like there may be a time you walk out there and you're a little too thin and you say, oh, we don't need a vertical mow this week. We're going to skip. We're going to wait. We're just a little thin. And you may say, well, I may need a little bit more fertility because I'm a little thin and go out and fertilize. But those kind of things, I don't know how you can plan it out, guys, where you just cookbook it. Think about it. The weather from year to year is so different. It can't be the same every year. So if you want it to be perfect, you need to have a putter and a ball and be on that green and be looking and say, boy, I remember one year in Memphis, we were doing once a week top dressing this summer, once a week vertical mowing, and we had a brutal stretch in 1 week of hot weather and humid. It was terrible, and we went back. We vertical mowed on Monday. We came back and vertical mowed again on Friday because it was just getting ahead. I said we need to vertical mow. So we ain't done it before. We're gonna do it twice this week, and or you get back to the next Monday and you're really, really thick, more than usual, go two directions. Go like 6-12, 9-3, and but still use the same setting, the same small blade. And but back to fertility again. I know my mind runs 10 times faster than I can speak, but I like fertility. I like Anderson's Contact DG primarily for two or three reasons. One, it's got a 70 SGN, and you need at least 100 SGN or smaller, and 70 smaller than 100 to get into the canopy on Ultradwarf and using a granular material. So always remember that, the SGN is the size guide number, tells you the size of the particle. And the other thing is that the DG particle, the dispersible granule particle, melts in when you water it, and it gets into the canopy, it gets into the soil, the target. You got to remember this, guys. Liquid. How much liquid fertility? Go look at the amount of. Just go to Chat GPT or something. Look at the nutrients that are downwardly mobile in a plant. It ain't many. It ain't very many. And grass evolved for millions of years, moving from nutrients to moving up from the root zone upward in the plant before man ever walked the planet and started mowing and playing golf on them. So it's still, I think it's the best way to fertilize if you really have the back. You can do the light frequent liquid thing, but if you really, I just seen it too many times. The root systems on the granular guys are better. They just are. And the Contact makes two products I really like. If you want quick release, there's a 6012, and notice the nitrogen source on both of these recommendations are low. And there's a 7-14-14, and they're Contact DG, and one's 6% in, one's 7% in, and those the reason those are low in and why I like those, both of those, particularly the 6012, is almost all soluble. The 7%, I believe, has like less than 1% slow in it, which is not going to hurt you. But you need that because you can go out when you have superfine particle, 70 SGN, and 6% in, you have to put more particles out to get 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen down. If you have a 30% in, it takes way less. But think about it, 6% on an 18% nitrogen, 6% is 3 times less. You're going to be putting out 3 times more particles per square foot than you are on 18% nitrogen. So you can go my point is you can go very low in, which is what you want to do. You don't want to go high, particularly when it's hot, because all of a sudden you got too much. But you can go, because you can't take it off. You can always go back with a second application, but you can go 6% or 7% in, and you can go down to 1/10 or 1/12 or even 1/15 of a pound in and still get good coverage. So that's why I like those products. Now, if you like a slow release and you want to have a grow in and you're trying to put as much nitrogen down, like a pound and a quarter a week on a grow in, they do make an 18-9-18 that's a big part, slow release, big fraction. And they've got well, that's just the 3 I'm real familiar with that I like. I love Anderson's because it disperses regardless of where it goes. It's got good coverage because it's 70 SGN, and it's just a heck of a good product. Anyway, I'm sitting here looking at my notes trying to think of what I hadn't covered. I've been rambling like a madman here. Think about this. This blade is right at 1 millimeter in diameter. The smallest the carbide tip you're going to get is about 1.2 millimeters, which does make a difference. That doesn't sound like much, but it's just a difference. But the big thing with the carbide blade, it's flat. It looks like, I'm trying to see something that's, it's like the end of this flash drive right here. It's square flat, and it's just pulling that grass up when it comes around. When it comes down, it's just pulling. As these blades wear, they become even more, a little bit more friendly. Now, let me say something about these blades. It's real important. Like, how do you set them? And that's huge. And they have a gauge out now that's a for vertical mowing. Uh, it sets it so you can actually, it's like an AccuGauge, gauge, and you can put the bar rests on the roller, front and back roller, and it can tell you exactly the depth of this gauge. It's got a little tab that comes in and hits this, and it's hitting it on the square right here, and you get this thing in the position, and you measure your depth of your gauge. Well, the first time you use these things, because they haven't worn much, and this square tip on the end here, it's not worn down yet, they're going to be a little more aggressive. And we always started these brand new, and I've done this 100 times. Well, not 100, but we've done it a bunch. These blades typically would last us 2 to 3 years, and you can get 2 or 3 years out of them typically. If you're running 2 units, if you're running 1 unit, you may only get 1 year out of them because your 1 unit's going over more area. And like I said, if you haven't tried these blades, it'll change your life. Guys, had guys come back and tell me it just made the incredible difference in their. I mean, I got stories, emails I can show you, and but when these are brand new, you want to set them at 0, and 0 is if my hand is ground, if this is ground right there, 0 is just touching ground, touching. So 0 versus sub-zero is going below ground, sub-zero, what I call sub-zero, a negative setting. Well, you start out at 0, first time out, it's going to be perfect, just about perfect. It's going to do a good job, and it's going to create that little line. It's not going to be too aggressive. It's going to produce clippings, and you can go maybe once or twice when it's new at 0, and then after that, you start going down, and every time you use it in -5 increments, it works great. So if I start at 0, I'll use it twice at 0. I'm going the next time, the third time at -5. So it's if this foam is right here is 0 on top, and then that's negative where it's going below grade. So you go a -5 thousandths. I say 5, it's 5 thousandths. The next time, after the fourth time you come out and use it, go a -10 thousandths. Now there may be some conditions that your sands particles, if it's too aggressive, you may have to back up and go back to -5 thousandths instead of a -10, but always go in fives and don't go any more than fives because you just get too aggressive. But usually like the fifth time you go a -15 thousandths, the next time a -20 thousandths, and after about a year you'll be at like a -70 thousandths. And then after a while this thing becomes rounded, and for some reason, I don't know why, it kind of bottoms out. And the lowest I've ever gotten with these is a -100. And that was in Texas. We could go 100. But we had 2 different sets of blades. And if you have 2 triplexes, you want to change them all the same so the settings can be the same so they'll wear equally. Don't change one and don't change the other, because a worn blade has got to be way more deep, negative depth. It's got to be at a more negative depth than a new blade. A new blade always has to start at 0. You set this booger up at like -50 at new, it's gonna be ugly. And just always remember, okay, if you take 2 brand new triplex or 2 new sets on 2 triplexes, you start at 0, and after year 2, you're at like a -80 or a -90. You'll find they need to be the same, but always remember they're going to get to a point. Ours usually bottomed out at about 90 or 100, and it just seemed like 100 was where we were at all the time. Now you got to remember, because these aren't carbide, they do wear, but it's not a big deal to set these up and change them. They need to be changed and adjusted. It's part of the management. It's part of looking at the greens, telling them it's too thick, it's too thin. Do we need to drop this week a -5 or not? But always drop a -5. But as these things wear, they do become a little more thinner, and they definitely become a lot more rounder on the tip. So just keep that, and you want that. You got to get one of those gauges because you need to be accurate with it. I know guys that try to do it with dimes and quarters and stuff. That's not scientific. I got some guys to buy the gauge, and they found out. And one of the reasons you need the gauge is because you need a number. You need a number. Like I wanted a number. I wanted my guy to tell me, and I would always put it in my phone, but usually before I got older, I knew where we were. I just could, I had the ability to remember all those things in my head. And I said, okay, we're at a negative 60. I want a -65. And then when they came in from mowing that day, and that was one of the things too, I always just kind of retentive personally. I wanted to be the guy in the morning with the flashlight looking at that blade and made sure that it was good, because you don't want a guy that doesn't know that that's way too deep or it's not right, or he made a mistake in the shop of setting it to keep vertical mowing those greens and vertical all 18 greens and run them. Because there's guys, and you know there are on the crew, that can do that. I mean, it's a good way to lose your job. I was just always paranoid about, I would always check them and make sure they were right. And the more we did it, the more refined we were, and I felt real confident about it. But I'd always check it in the morning. And at the end of the day, when they came in, the mechanic would call me and say, all right, what do you want to do? I said, yeah, we're at 65. We're going to 70. We're going to go -70 for next week. And every now and then I say, no, we're not aggressive enough, because I would be looking at the greens on the last greens mowed, because these things wear as they go around. That's why they need to be reset each time they come in, because you could be set at 70,000 steps. In time you get through mowing, you may be more like 68 or 67, because there's going to be some wear on this tip. So you need to readjust. And I would tell them, like, if we were real good, I'd say, no, just leave it at 65 or leave it at 70 or whatever. So it's an art. This whole thing really boils down to one thing. You can't replace a good superintendent, and you can't replace experience, and you can't. I tell people all the time, having incredible greens is about 70% art. It really is. The 30% is just the agronomy part of it. And there may be more than that, to be honest with you. And I tell people all the time, they ask me, like, who's a good superintendent? I said, well, I can tell you this, it's your green quality is going to be 90% based on who's managing it. That's just what it is. It's 90% the guy taking care of it. Genetics and all the great quality of ultra dwarf can only get you so far. So just remember that. And I hope this makes some sense. But always remember, it's all about you looking at it. And if you're going real fast, don't get too thick. Go out and vertical mow it and top dress it a little bit heavier. You can catch up with a little bit thicker top dressing. I know people don't like it, mechanics don't like it, but sometimes you got to do what's best for the grass to catch up. It ain't going to hurt it. Just don't smother it. But you can catch up, and you can double vertical mow, go two different directions. Now, it's one thing I forgot to mention. Like, people say, well, don't vertical mow, just like mowing. Never try to change your directional pattern. At least give 4 directions on vertical mowing. We would try to do 6-12, 9-3. Notice we're going 90 degrees to the last previous time that we did it, which is what we like to do. Then we'd come in and go 10-4, 2-8, and then start over. And we had a rotation. We go 6-12, 9-3, 10-4, 2-8. And we went, every week we changed back to where we were supposed to be. We kept a log of where we were going. And I think that's enough directional change to do everything you need to do. But if you're doing it 2 directions Always backtrack, and if you decide you need a little bit extra, just go two directions. But if you go two directions, go crossways like that. That's what I recommend. Seems to do better. It'll make it look like a waffle pattern, and boy, does it putt good behind that. Putt's awesome. The speed of the putt. Um, I just had a thought too about top dressing that I wanted to relate to you. That when we were doing a USGA seminar out in Tucson with Brian, and Brian and I were talking about how it's faster with sand. And I said, well, I think I know why, but I'm not sure. But and we had never taken a look at this, but it does make the surface firmer, so that's one thing working in your favor. But the sand, if you get it down thick enough, that ball is riding. It's only riding on so much leaf tissue. Part of the ride on that ball is on sand, and sand is a hell of a lot harder than thatch. So and it's a lot firmer. So one of the things that you do when you top dress, you may not think about it, but you're artificially raising the ground. Think about it. You may not lower the mowers, but I think what happens is your effective mowing height becomes lower in a way, in a sense, because I'm going to use this as an example. If these blades are the leaf blades on the grass, and this is the ground level, this piece of paper, and you're looking at this in a macro and with a magnifying glass, and it looks this big, okay? And that's the length of the blade from the white to the tip of that blade is the leaf blade. Well, if you top dress that and you fill that up with sand to there, now your leaf blade is only half as long as it was. So you actually briefly raise the ground. You raise the ground and you shorten the length of the blade of grass. And this I do know, that if your blade of grass is longer, it's going to affect the roll on the golf ball more. Let me show you. My old back's killing me. This ball is only so tall, and the taller the blade of grass is, the further up on the sides of the ball it reaches. If you put this in a half-inch rough, or I mean a 1-inch rough, and try to putt, well, the blades of grass are right here. Well, that's like a car tire hitting a curb, a big curb. That's why it's so slow. And that's one of the reasons Ultradwarf putts so well, is that when it's short, the ball is riding on top of the grass. It's riding on top of the blades. So the longer the blades of grass, like right here, the more it affects the sides of the ball. It slows it down. The shorter the blades of grass, the more it's riding on top. The longer it starts affecting the sides, and it's just more resistance. So we actually Brian did we did a prism gauge reading before and after top dressing in Tucson on Ultradwarf. I think it was Stiff Eagle, and we definitely got a lower effective cutting height reading after top dressing, because now that ground had been raised, and now that gauge was sitting on that sand. And so the effective cutting height, those blades of grass on that prism gauge were not as tall. They were shorter, and the green had not been mowed any different. So that tells you really why that ball rolls faster after you top dress, because until that sand gets worked in and that grass grows through it, you really never think about that, but it does play an effect. And that's another thing with top dressing, why you have to increase. I don't know if you've noticed this, but as it gets warmer and hot and grass is growing real fast in the summertime, you need to put out a little bit more sand, because it just gobbles it up. It just grows through it quicker. If you top dress at the same thickness in the fall that you did in the summer, it hangs around for an extra week. Whereas in the summer, that wouldn't hang around for 2 or 3 days. It's because the grass grows through it and it just gobbles it up. It just overcomes it. So anyway, I know I've run on too far with this, but I'll try to put out a few more things. I have a lot of ideas from the years I worked, but I can tell you, just remember this: light frequent beats the hell out of heavy infrequent, and it's so much more golfer friendly. And if you can do this, you'll have better greens than you've ever had before. And I've had guys that would come to our seminar in Memphis and go home and do these practices, and their greens weren't very good, and they had Ultradwarf. And I'd get 2 or 3 guys say the same comment. He said, "We're so good now, I cannot be fired." And that's kind of true. If you have great greens, it's hard to get fired. But anyway, great talking to you, and thank you.